All right. So Ohio State fans, if they win the game, obviously they're going to need some help, and that help or to get into the playoffs. So that help is probably going to come in the form of TCU beating Oklahoma. Whether or not that's going to happen obviously remains to be seen, but we're here to talk about it. And we're going to talk about Oklahoma and TCU with some people who probably aren't super familiar with our channel. Oklahoma fans will be. If you saw us last year, we did pick Auburn to beat you, and we did feel pretty good about it until Sean White got hurt. But we're not going there. So Oklahoma comes in this game with a ton of momentum, and I would argue that if they're not number one, they're at least firmly deserving number two and deservingly in the thick of the playoff discussion. They've got the one blip on the radar, but we've talked about in other games this week that this year, unlike previous years in the past, losing to an unranked team is not an immediate disqualifier for the playoffs. But talk a little bit about kind of what you talked about with Syracuse and Clemson, in that the losing to an unranked team isn't necessarily, in this year at all, a disqualifier for your resume for the playoffs, but may show some warning signs and some red flags in terms of whether or not you can win the playoffs.
When you lose to an unranked team, it's certainly a blemish, but the reality is all our playoff champions have had a loss. And in some cases, they have unranked losses. Football is a very variable sport. We talk about that a lot because we're a statistics-based channel, and we're statistics-based because we try to be very objective, and we're trying to talk with some basis and not just give hot takes, but try to actually give some sort of meaningful analysis to come to the conclusions that we reach. When you lose to an unranked team, it tells us usually one of two things. One, did you lose to a team in a way that you would have never lost to any other team, even teams that were better, and haven't done all year? In which case, yeah, it's a blip. Or two, did you lose to an unranked team in a fashion that exposes that you have some sort of significant weakness? A lot of times when you lose those games, you can come back and you can play through and you can win a championship because that game, maybe it hurts your resume. Maybe it's a knock on the resume discussion of whether you deserved it or earned it. But from the predictive discussion, when we're talking about whether you're going to win the game or whether you're going to win the playoff, maybe it doesn't have any correlation with how anything you've done all year. The one area where it does become a concern, though, is if when you lost because you had some issue where you had a lot of close games and you didn't pull one out. And Miami was that discussion. They've had close games all year. And the Pitt game statistically was an aberration. That was the worst offensive performance they had all year by a significant margin against a team that doesn't make any sense. But they've been flirting with that all season. And it confirmed that as much as people love to say, well, we know how to win in the clutch, a lot of times you win in the clutch because you're the better team. And there's a lot of teams that are in a lot of close games. And sometimes it's everybody has these 5 close games. There's 12 teams that have 5 close games. And it really just is luck that of the 12 teams, one of them is going to win 5 of them and the others are going to split the rest. If any of you are familiar with the statistical concept of clustering, if you have a lot of data, and in this case, lots and lots of games, right? 130 teams, all playing 12 games, hundreds of games, in fact, over 1,000 games being played, right? About 1,500 games. You're going to have some teams that play some average games and just come up on top. So it's about distinguishing between the two. It's about saying what is an actual trend, what is a game we've got to take something away from, and what's sort of a statistical aberration. That's where, when you say eye test, we're not talking about how good or bad you look, but a lot of what our channel is looking at the data and not being completely blind to it, but trying to interpret it. And that's where the unranked losses come into play, in my opinion, more than anything. It's one unranked loss, not a big deal. That doesn't kill you. But did that unranked loss actually tell us something? Did it show a trend? That's what's important.
All right, so I'm gonna go kind of staying in the same pattern with you. And Oklahoma fans, listen, we're not killing your team. We think you're an excellent team. We think you're a playoff absolute national champion contender. We're just trying to air out some warts on both sides to see where there's some opportunities for the other team. So don't drop off quite yet. But having said that, is it fair if I said this? I'm more concerned, or I'm less concerned about Oklahoma giving up 38 and losing to Iowa State on the road, as I am Oklahoma giving up 35 to Kansas State in a one-score win, even if it is in Manhattan. And I say that because we are talking about a Kansas State team that scored 7 points against Vanderbilt. And I'm not getting into, we don't really do a lot of transitive property, but what we do see is when they are this far out of line, like anybody in the SEC, even trash SEC teams have run it up on Vanderbilt. I think Tennessee, garbage Tennessee, scored 24 last weekend against Vanderbilt. So Kansas State comes in, manages 7 whole points against Vanderbilt and loses. And then midway through the season, puts it all over Oklahoma for 3 quarters, ends up losing 1 score, but still 35 points. Is it fair to say that that's probably a more scary sort of data point for Oklahoma than even the loss to Iowa State?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it goes back to exactly what I was saying. I don't think the fact that they lost to Iowa State is the predictive thing there. That's a resume question. That's a whether they should get into the playoff question. If we're talking about how good they are, whether they're going to win this game against TCU, my concern is they give up 38 to Iowa State. Then they give up 24 to Texas. Then they give up 35 to Kansas State. They give up 27 to Texas Tech. They gave up 52 to Oklahoma State. They couldn't stop anybody all year, no matter how good they are. That's a concern. And they did stop, they stopped. Who have they held under 20 points? They held UTEP, Tulane, Kansas, Ohio State. So there's a sign that they can do well. And they held TCU to 20. But in most of their games, they haven't been able to do it. So I'm with you. I think it is very concerning. And this goes back to the discussion of Miami. Miami had these struggle wins, if you want to call it that, because their offense couldn't score enough to distance themselves from their opponents. And they'd been able to play well against big name teams up until the point where they couldn't. And that's the concern, is the Iowa State game. The reason they lost that game wasn't isolated. That when they played another worse team, they had the same problem. They may have won that game, but they had the same problem. So I do think it's a trend with Oklahoma, and it's very concerning.
So again, not doing transitive property and saying X beat Y, so X is going to beat Z because Z lost to Y. I do think it's interesting if you look up and down the TCU schedule and you look up and down the Oklahoma schedule, it's very similar in a very different way in that they beat a lot of these teams by close to the same margins as Oklahoma, but they do it with much better defense, but much lower offensive capacity. So if we're looking at this in a postseason matchup with momentum, who do you want? Do you want the team with the easily better defense or the team with the easily better offense in a one-game scenario? Not talking about a whole season, but just in a one-game scenario, not addressing the fact that Oklahoma's already beat TCU. We'll talk about that in a minute. But just on that alone, which one would you rather have?
I think I'm going to have to split my answer in half. But in this game, if you're playing the conference championship game, give me the team with a good passing offense. Now, we talk about this a lot. When we look at opponent averages and opponent allowed averages defensively, which is something we calculate as an intermediary statistic, it's really, I won't say easy, but it's fairly common for elite teams to hold their opponents to under 75% of their rushing averages. It happens all around college football. There's probably about 10 to 15 teams that do it this year. It's really dadgum uncommon to hold a team to under 75% of their opponent passing averages. In fact, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember us ever modeling a team that managed to do that at the end of the season. So, if you've got a dominant offense like this, if it was a rushing attack, give me the defense because the rushing attack you can stop. If it's a passing attack, if you've got a Baker Mayfield, the same way when Clemson had Deshaun Watson, dominant passing attacks tend to score well regardless of who they're playing. If they're truly dominant, a truly elite passing attack is just tremendously hard to slow down. And you can do it. I mean, you can have but what it takes is the Denver Broncos scenario where you're just blitzing the crap out of them. The guy can't get a pass off. Then they can sort of sputter and slow down. But the other thing, pulling on that same issue, you're Peyton Manning in the Super Bowl scenario, right? The thing that can really hurt a passing offense, in my opinion, is time off. And we've seen this really frequently. And Oklahoma, I think, ran into this when they lost the national title to Florida. Passing offenses are kind of so self-dependent. They're dependent upon how much you're in rhythm, how well your timing is. There's a long layoff to the playoffs. And in that layoff, you always lose something. I pretty much can never think of a passing offense that hasn't, up to the point really of Deshaun Watson, frankly. But most of the time, we'll say 80% of the time, passing offense really kind of loses something in that interim. And playoff games and championship games typically end up being really decided by the team that runs the ball better and is more physical. I think to a large extent, it's because passing offenses just need a few games to get in rhythm. So this is when I said I split it in half. What I really mean is in this championship game context for the conference where they're coming into the end of the season and they're hot, that dominant passing offense is hard to stop. But come playoff time, I think it's going to be very difficult for Oklahoma to maintain the same level of intensity and success that they have right now.
And what does it say then, if we're going back to specifically the Oklahoma and TCU game? What does it say to you as someone who historically has said, I want a passing offense, big numbers in the passing offense is hard to repeat on a consistent basis. I want a team that plays good defense and can run the ball. And I think Baker Mayfield is kind of an exception when you're talking about a Heisman potential quarterback. What is your takeaway from the TCU Oklahoma game earlier this year where Oklahoma scored 38, but most of their eye-popping production came from Rodney Anderson at running back? And not only the 23 carries, 6.6 yards per, 2 touchdowns on 151 yards, rushing, but he was also a huge factor in the passing game as well. What does it tell you that Oklahoma beat TCU by a considerable margin, and they did it mostly the statistical performance that was eye-popping was from the running back?
Well, first off, the interesting thing there was the parallel between that game and what happened in the Oklahoma-Ohio State game. Because also in that Oklahoma-Ohio State game, they really struggled to get their receivers involved in the game, right? Their leading receiver was Dimitri Flowers with 98 yards receiving. That was a fullback. So I think really when you look at that and you try to break it down and understand what it means, one, I don't think they were really able to replace the production from the previous year in the receiving game, right? They don't have D.D. Westbrook on that offense, and I think it shows. But I think what you're also seeing is that Baker Mayfield was able to create, frankly. And I think Anderson took over the game. I mean, it was just kind of bizarre, right? That he was able to do that quite the way he did. And I think say it was bizarre because he hadn't completely taken over a game like that really all year. I mean, he was similarly dominant against Texas Tech, but they don't really have a defense. Didn't really get any carries early in the season, but he hasn't, Kansas, he didn't run the ball that successfully. Didn't run the ball that successfully against Oklahoma State. So I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that it's hard to stop Baker Mayfield. And when teams take away one component, Ohio State did everything they could to keep the receivers blanketed. he hit the fullback and used the fullback to get yardage because he was the guy that had a matchup advantage because Ohio State wasn't really trying to cover the fullbacks and tight ends so much as they were trying to make sure the receivers were covered. With TCU, they really exploited the way the linebackers were being used in those matchups, and they hit the running back repeatedly. And to me, that's just the sign of a great quarterback that he finds the matchup, he finds the open guy, goes through his progressions, and he's not stuck with a particular receiver. He's going to make a play however it's there. And that's why I say when you have truly elite passing attacks, they tend to work regardless of what happens because on a run play, you can stop the run. It's kind of simple on what happens, and you attack the line of scrimmage, and the guy's got to get outside the box if he wants to do anything. But in the passing game, you have the entire field at your disposal. And if you have an elite passing game with a lot of different weapons and a very good quarterback, he can attack you a lot of different ways, and there's no one scheme that can compensate. So that was my takeaway. I don't know that there was anything. I do think there was an issue with the matchup of the linebackers at TCU and Anderson. But I think a lot of it was just the fact that when TCU played them, they played them a certain way. They tried to take away the receiving core, and at the same time, they gave up some stuff underneath. They allowed Anderson to take over the game. I think they're going to look back at that. They're probably going to have to come back this game, and they're probably going to have to give more to the receivers. They can't play quite, put as many isolation plays in the running back, and they're not going to be able to do as some of the things they did in that last game. So I don't know that you can take a lot of it in a predictive sense to say Anderson will do it again. I think there's a matchup issue, but heaven knows TCU is not going to let that same problem occur. But what it does tell me is that Mayfield finds ways to make things work, and however TCU adjusts, my tendency is to think that Baker Mayfield is going to have a way to respond.
All right, so let's get into the computer model then. Go 90 seconds on what the computer model does. We've got a new audience, I think, for this game, and potentially one of these teams. Well, yeah, I mean, if Oklahoma wins this game, they're in the playoffs. TCU would probably need some kind of help, but we will probably be talking about one, if not both of these teams a little bit later once we get into the bowl season. So let's familiarize them with the model and just get into what it says, and let's go from there.
Our model takes per play statistics, as we said earlier, and we look at how you do against how your opponents do. So, how did you do in this particular games against your opponents? How well do your opponents do against everybody they played? And we use that to determine what your relative strength is given your competition. We use per play statistics because total yardage tends to be too determined by number of drives and tempo and a lot of other things that aren't very good indicators, particularly in a matchup sense. Based off that, we calculate some intermediate statistics. One of the big ones we always refer to is opponent defensive percentages allowed. So how much, if your opponent's average 5 yards per carry and you will only allow 4, then you're only giving up 80% of opponent averages. So we're weighting really heavily for how good your opponents are, which is important when you have conferences like the Big 12 that pass so much. And then based off all that, we go and look at your historical data and say, okay, if this is the production you're getting on offense, this is how many points we should expect you to score. We have no subjective constants in this model. I don't apply any sort of personal sort of trends. It's very neutral and bland. I like it that way because it's a good pace discussion point, and I'm not injecting myself into this model. It's designed to show you statistically the B game from Team A and the B game from Team B. If they play each other, what does it look like? And anything I do to talk about, calculate injuries or home field advantage or lineup consistencies or injuries, on the offensive line and how many snaps they have, those require me to inject some sort of constant to talk about how it should be evaluated because there's no historical way to do it. This is much more straightforward than that. And then we take that model and use it as a baseline for a discussion, knowing we have an objective starting point. So breaking this down, I think the first thing to note, unsurprisingly, Oklahoma is just straight up not very good defensively. Giving up 98% of opponent rush averages and 101% of opponent passing averages. Now, first off, that's not terrible. And I think a lot of people feel like their defense is just straight bad or terrible. It's not really true. In a per play sense, they give up right at what your average is. Now, you don't want to give up an opponent's average because there's enough cupcakes built into their schedule and enough bad teams that their average, that's their average when they played basically an unranked opponent. So if you're giving up opponent averages, that's not good. That's you're doing what an unranked team would do, but it's not terrible either. We've had a lot worse. We've had several teams in the SEC this year we've talked about extensively, cough, Florida, and Tennessee, that are giving up 110% plus of opponent rush averages. Oklahoma is better than those teams. It's just that they play so darn many snaps that they're giving up a lot more points. On the flip side, TCU is very good against the run. Anything below 70% against the run we consider elite. They're right at that mark, right at 70%. Against the pass, they're good. But I think the interesting thing is they're not really elite. We consider 85 to 90% to be good pass defense. Anything above 90%, you start getting into average. They're at 89%. So they're not a dominant pass defense. They're merely a good one. Where they really excel is against the run. There's kind of a tremendous irony there, given that Rodney Anderson tore them up on the ground. But I think that had to do with a little bit with how they were trying to play Oklahoma in that last game. So all that stuff considered, when we look at those averages, this game is projecting that Oklahoma's not going to run the ball very well. They really shouldn't be able to. They should average 3.95 yards per carry. That's right at about half of what they averaged last time they played. A little bit more than that. But it's also saying that Oklahoma should average 11 yards per attempt. Now, when they played TCU last time, they did, 12.3 yards per attempt, which was even higher than that. So basically, on both instances, this model is saying they shouldn't do quite as well as they did last time. But regardless, 7.3 yards per play. That's a ton. And if you get over 7 yards per play, you're basically going to move the ball at will. TCU offensively just isn't quite as potent as Oklahoma because no one is. But they should be able to average 4.3 yards per carry. The run game should operate just as efficiently as it has been able to operate all year. And the pass game should be probably as or more effective. It's expecting them to get 8 yards per attempt. And that comes out to about a 6 yard per play average. So that projected score then, all put together based off historical data, is Oklahoma 37, TCU 29.
It's interesting because it's a closer margin than obviously what we've seen on the field, but that game was a road game for TCU. It's probably a little bit of a shock seeing that offense up close and personal for the first time. But look, they've I want to say, I mean, they've stymied a lot of offenses, decent offenses this year, to no production. Then they faced some other offenses like Oklahoma State, where they got a lot of credit for, yeah, you gave up some points, but given how good that offense is, giving up some points is fine. I think there's more of the same here with Oklahoma. If you hold Oklahoma to, under 50 this year, you're probably having a good day. I am interested, like you noted, that the expectation is that Oklahoma's defense is just garbage. And I felt to a large extent that it was last year. I go back to the bowl game with Auburn. I hate that our data point for the Oklahoma and Auburn game to look at what the high-flying offense with the bad defense does against a team that's got a good defense. I hate that data point had to be with Auburn with an injured quarterback, because what they put in there, the offense that they rolled out with Sean White was okay. The one they rolled out without Sean White was terrible, which other SEC teams proved that to be. So it was a terrible data point for us. So we don't really have that outside of the Big 12 this year, except for Ohio State. But that long-winded roundabout thing brings me back to that game. Holding Ohio State to 16 points is a big deal. They didn't score their average against Ohio State, but they didn't have to. I'm interested in the model because it does close that gap considerably. But I think TCU is going to be outmatched again. Unlike the Georgia-Auburn game, where I think a lot of what we saw in that game was Georgia had some missed opportunities that could have really turned that game in a different direction. I felt like coming away from the Oklahoma TCU game that Oklahoma was just a better team. Now, some teams play a whole lot better at home, and Oklahoma's road law or unranked loss was on the road, so there's a lot at play there. But I'm going with the model on this score. I like it. I usually don't go with the model. I usually have a little bit of nuance there. This is twice this week that I've gone with the model, so that's pretty rare. After my long-winded, not rant, but discussion, I'm curious if you're going with the model with this one or if you are seeing it a little differently.
Again, and it's happened a bunch when we're doing these conference championship games. I think the model's pretty solid. And I think before I touch it, you noted last year our one real data point with Oklahoma was that Auburn game. Auburn struggled against, nearly lost, to Vanderbilt, lost to Georgia because they couldn't move the ball without their starting quarterback. So those weren't really shocking results when they played Oklahoma. And that's not a ding on Oklahoma. It was more of a ding on real deficiencies that Auburn had that they've finally cured with Stidham. But looking at this game, I think the interesting thing here is the prediction is 37 points for Oklahoma. They scored 38 points against TCU last time. Now, my model does not have any sort of built-in thing to say, oh, you're a repeat team, you should do exactly the same against the previous team. It is totally dependent upon the season as a whole. We do that on purpose because we found more often than not, you may go on some runs and there may be some particular, ups and downs, but the best predictor for future results is to look at the entire season. What it's saying is that 38 points last time against TCU was exactly what you should expect given their Oklahoma's offense against TCU's defense. But the one thing that's different here is that TCU is predicted to have 29 points, which is 10 points higher, about 50% more points against Oklahoma than they were able to do previously. I think the interesting thing with TCU this season is that Kenny Hill doesn't throw a lot of touchdown passes. And you can look at it and go, well, he's thrown 19. It's like, yeah, but of those 19, 13 of the 19 came against Kansas, Jackson State, and Southern Methodist. In the rest of the games, all year, they threw 6. And of those 6, again, half are at Baylor. So if you want to look at Oklahoma, he threw 1. West Virginia, he threw 1. Oklahoma State, he threw 1. Didn't throw one against Arkansas. Didn't throw one against Kansas State, Iowa State, Texas. Not a single touchdown pass. They put up all those points because of the run game. And so I think the issue for TCU is they don't have the potency offensively with Kenny Hill to just score gangbusters in a shootout. You can win a shootout with a run game, but it's tough because the run game is impacted so heavily by negative plays, and you can do so much. As we said, you can do so much to scheme about it. It is quite possible to shut down run games. It's a lot harder to shut down a passing game. We saw Kenny Hill in the SEC, for a few years, and we know what he looks like. And the guy is capable of making any throw on the field, but he's just kind of sporadic and he's not overly consistent. And while he can go off against really, really bad defenses, sometimes he just kind of struggles. So my takeaway here, in terms of prediction, I think 38-20 wasn't shocking. I think probably it's going to go more high scoring because I think TCU is going to have to be more aggressive. I think they realize they can't slow play Oklahoma, but I also don't think TCU can win in a shootout. So I think probably 41-31 is my guess. Still a closer game, but I think what's going to happen is TCU is going to run the ball. They're going to throw it. They're going to be able to stop the run, but they're going to give up more pass plays as a result. And when they get on offense and they've given up all those pass plays and they've given up all those points, I just don't think Kenny Hill is going to be consistent enough to go blow for blow. And at the end of the game, Oklahoma is going to be able to pull away. But I say all that and to say, if he's on, this game could turn out any way you want to have it. And that's the problem when we talked about earlier with Oklahoma. When you give up this many points, you leave yourself really darn susceptible because pass games are sporadic. You can have a bad day It just takes a couple negative plays from Mayfield to have a huge impact. The problem is though, from in a one-off scenario, I just can't pick TCU to win this game.
All right, I think we've probably lost all the TCU fans who fired up this video thinking they'd get some analysis in their favor. I do think it's hard to get past the data point we already have with them on the field, and that's really that. In the numbers is the only place we're going. We don't dislike TCU. I actually think they've got a phenomenal coach who would do very well in the SEC. I've just got to look at what does the data say, what do the numbers say, and then we can't get past this one data point we have. They've already played. So this was a fun one. This was a great championship week. It was a lot of fun. There's a lot of discussion to be had about the playoffs, but if things go the way that they're favored or the way we picked them in this championship week, I think there's not going to be a lot of discussion. I think we're going to know who we're going to get. So TCU Oklahoma fans, in the comments, let us know what you think the score is going to be. So give us your score predictions, back it up with data. And TCU fans, tell us why we're wrong. Tell us why you think your team's going to win. Give us who you think your MVP is going to be. And y'all play it clean and back your positions up with data, and we'll have a lot of fun in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. If you liked it, give us a like. If you loved it, we'd love a subscribe. Have a good one. God bless.